During a routine traffic stop, a black man is slapped by an officer. But what she doesn't realize is this man isn't just anyone. He's her boss. The truth hits her like a punch to the gut. And now, everything's about to change. What happens next will cost her more than she ever imagined. What would you do if you were in this situation? How would you handle an unjust attack from someone who didn't even know who you were? Let us know in the comment. Before we dive in, let us know in the comment, where are you watching from? Robert Bennett had always been the type of person who worked hard for everything he earned. A high-ranking official at the city's police department, he was known for his level-headed approach, fairness, and dedication to justice. Climbing the ranks hadn't been easy, but he did it with integrity and respect. He'd worked tirelessly to build a reputation. But that day, everything changed. Little did he know that a simple traffic stop was about to test everything he believed in. Officer Sandra Green was still new to the force, eager to prove herself. At first glance, she seemed like just another young cop with ambition and energy. But what many didn't see was the deep-seated prejudice that had been ingrained in her over the years. Growing up in an environment where racism was normalized, Green often acted on those biases without realizing it. And that day, her unchecked actions were about to set off a chain of events that would bring everything crashing down. It was just another afternoon for Robert, running errands and blending into the daily rhythm of the city. He didn't expect any confrontation. But when Officer Green pulled him over for what seemed like a minor issue, the interaction quickly escalated. What should have been a routine traffic stop turned violent, triggering a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. From the moment Green approached his car, something didn't feel right. Her aggressive attitude and unprofessional behavior were impossible to ignore. Robert had no idea that this stop would unravel a toxic reality within the police department, one that had been simmering for far too long. As Robert sat in his car, he couldn't help but feel the annoyance of a minor traffic issue. The light had changed, and he was in the wrong lane, nothing more. A quick fix, right? But then he saw her, Officer Green, walking toward him with an aggressive, almost confrontational stance. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked, her voice sharp and full of judgment. Robert was taken aback. This wasn't how these situations normally went. He stayed calm, explaining what happened. But Green wasn't listening. She was already looking at him as though he had done something wrong, something beyond the trivial mistake of being in the wrong lane. "Step out of the vehicle," she demanded, not asking, but ordering. Robert hesitated, feeling a tightening in his chest. This wasn't right, but he complied. Before he could even process it, Green's anger had flared, and her tone had become more hostile. "Do you think you're above the law?" she snapped, walking closer. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to explain," Robert responded, his voice steady. But it didn't matter. She was too far gone, her mind already made up, and her words came faster, more harsh. "I said step out of the vehicle," she shouted, her face twisted in an expression he'd never seen before, even in the harshest of confrontations. Robert could feel the pressure building. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was something more. Trying to keep the situation calm, Robert asked for her badge number. It was a polite, rational request, one he had a right to make. But the reaction it sparked was anything but rational. "Who do you think you are?" Green shot back, her voice filled with venom. And before he could even blink, the slap hit his face with a force that rang through the air. The sound echoed. A sharp, hard crack that made nearby pedestrians stop and stare. Robert's head snapped to the side. His face stung with the sudden, brutal pain, but it wasn't just the physical sting that made his blood boil. It was the utter disrespect, the humiliation, that sent waves of anger through him. How dare she? How dare she slap him in the middle of the street like this? Robert stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. His pride wasn't going to let him retaliate, not in front of witnesses. But inside he was furious, trying to regain his composure. This was not how he envisioned his afternoon going. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered under his breath, trying to keep his cool. But Green wasn't finished. She kept pressing, her aggression unyielding. Every word, every demand felt more intrusive, more personal. The officers nearby stood watching. Robert could see their eyes flicking between him and Green. Some looked unsure. Some tried to keep their distance. They had seen this before, but this was different. They weren't sure what to do. Would they step in? Would they call for backup? Or would they let it escalate further? The tension was thick in the air, and with every second that passed, Robert's anger grew, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. Would anyone step in before things got worse? Would this situation blow over? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger? Then, just as Robert began to wonder how far this could go, he knew it was time to act. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against his badge. He pulled it out slowly, his eyes never leaving Green's face. As he revealed it, his words cut through the tense air like a blade. "I'm your superior officer," he said coldly, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside him. It took a moment for Green to register what had just happened. Her face drained of color, and her eyes widened in shock as the weight of her actions finally hit her. She had slapped her superior officer, someone who had the power to end her career in an instant. Her body seemed to freeze as she took a step back, her breath shallow, unable to fully grasp what she had just done. Robert stood there, calm and composed on the outside, but inside his heart was pounding. He had been tested in a way he never expected, and now the consequences of Green's actions were about to unfold in a way she couldn't have prepared for. Her world was about to collapse, but she had no idea just how fast it was going to happen. The officers around them could sense the shift. They could see the horror and realization dawning on Green's face. What had started as a traffic stop had escalated into something far more significant. For Green, the cost of her mistake was going to be much more than a slap in the face. It was going to be a career-ending mistake. Green's face was still frozen in disbelief, her eyes locked on the badge Robert had just revealed. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had slapped her superior officer, the very person who had the authority to destroy her career in an instant. Her body stiffened, her breath shallow. What had she just done? She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. For a brief moment, there was silence between them. Robert's face remained stoic, but inside his anger was building. How could she have treated him this way? A fellow officer, someone who had worked hard to get where he was. How could she be so blind to her own prejudice? His jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He couldn't afford to let his emotions show. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about much more than that. The other officers who had been standing by began to stir. Their shock was palpable. Some exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Others, their faces pale, seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation. One officer, clearly uncomfortable with what had just unfolded, stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Do you realize what you just did?" he asked. His words weren't harsh, but filled with disbelief. Green didn't respond. She stood there, frozen, her face drained of color. Her lips moved, but no words came out. The reality of what she had done, who she had done it to, was beginning to sink in. She had just disrespected the wrong person, and now there would be consequences. Robert, calm but commanding, spoke up. "You will face the consequences for this," he said. His voice was firm, unwavering. He couldn't let her get away with this. He couldn't let anyone think they could behave this way, especially not someone in law enforcement. Robert's mind raced, torn between his duty as a leader and his personal sense of justice. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't about personal vendettas. It was about the institution he had spent his life serving. The incident had opened his eyes to something much bigger than just a slap. It wasn't just about disrespecting him as an individual. It was about the deep-seated issues within the department. This wasn't an isolated incident. Green's behavior was a symptom of something far worse. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't sweep it under the rug like so many had done before. He had to address this, not just for himself, but for the integrity of the entire police force. Lena had worked hard to get to where she was. She had seen corruption and racism before, but this was different. This was a moment where the personal and professional collided. It was a moment that would change everything. The respect he had for the department, the values he had believed in, all of it was now on the line. Green's panic was evident. She stepped back, stammering, her voice shaky as she tried to apologize. "I didn't mean it," she said, her words cracking. She wasn't just apologizing to Robert anymore. She was begging for forgiveness from everyone who was watching. But her apology was empty. It couldn't fix what had just happened. Robert wasn't interested in her excuses. This wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about clearing her conscience. It was about accountability, and Robert had made up his mind. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He wasn't going to pretend this was a one-off mistake. He wasn't going to let Green or anyone else believe that actions like this had no consequences. "You'll be held accountable," Robert said firmly. His words were final, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Your actions will have consequences, whether you like it or not." Green's face fell as the weight of her mistake settled in. She had crossed a line, and Robert was going to make sure she knew the full extent of her actions. There was no going back for her now. Robert stood there, looking at Green, his mind racing. The slap, the disrespect, had triggered something deep within him. It wasn't just about one officer acting out. It was about something bigger, something that had been festering for far too long. As much as he wanted to address the immediate issue, Green's reckless behavior, he realized this was part of a much larger problem. This wasn't an isolated mistake. This wasn't just a rogue officer acting on impulse. It was a symptom of a much deeper, more ingrained issue within the department and, by extension, the entire law enforcement system. The biases, the prejudices, the systemic racism, he couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just Green who was part of this toxic culture. It was the whole system that had allowed it to thrive. The moment with Green had been a wake-up call, one that Robert knew he couldn't ignore. He had spent his career trying to make changes within the department, trying to enforce fairness, trying to break down the barriers that kept people like Green in positions of power. But this slap, this moment of injustice was the catalyst he needed. It was time to confront the truth of what had been allowed to happen for too long. Robert couldn't just sit back and let this slide. He was the chief, and he had the responsibility, not just to his position, but to the people he served, to the community, to the officers who worked for him. The weight of the moment hit him hard. For too long, he had tried to balance the system, walking the line between upholding the law and keeping the peace. But now he knew that the balance had shifted. It wasn't enough to just manage the system anymore. He had to fix it. The truth had been staring him in the face all along, but he hadn't fully seen it until now. The question was no longer about Green. It was about what he, as the head of the department, was going to do about it. As Robert looked down at Green, his emotions were still simmering beneath the surface. He had been angry, humiliated, disrespected, but now that anger had shifted. He wasn't just upset about what had happened to him. He was furious about the system that had allowed Green and others like her to rise through the ranks. The personal part of him wanted revenge, but the professional part knew this was bigger than just his own pride. This wasn't about him. It was about the people who depended on him to make the right call, to make sure that this kind of behavior was never tolerated again. Standing there, Robert knew that the decision he made now would ripple through the entire department, through every officer who worked under him. He was the one who had the power to change the course of things. He had worked hard to get to where he was, but now he realized that his role was not just to lead. It was to make a difference. And that meant holding people accountable, even when it wasn't easy. Green, still standing there in shock, didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. She had slapped her superior officer, and now the consequences were far-reaching. She had crossed a line she couldn't come back from, and Robert knew that. But he wasn't just angry at her. He was angry at the system that had allowed her to act this way in the first place. He was angry at the department that had turned a blind eye to the biases of its officers. This wasn't personal. This was about change. This was about setting an example. If Robert let Green get away with it, if he let her apology be enough, nothing would change. It would send a message that this behavior was acceptable, that people like her could continue to operate unchecked, spreading their prejudice and hate. But if he held her accountable, it would send a clear message to every officer that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for his entire career. He wasn't just chief of police for a title. He was chief because he had the power to change things, to make a real difference. And right now, he needed to take that power and use it. He needed to show everyone, Green, the other officers, and the community, that this wasn't just about a slap. It was about the future of the department. Green, Robert's voice was firm and steady. You've made a huge mistake, and you'll be held accountable. This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's ever had to deal with prejudice and bias in this department. This is about justice, about doing what's right. And right now, what's right is making sure you face the consequences for your actions. Green's face was pale, her breath shallow. She had made a mistake. But what she didn't realize was how much this mistake was going to cost her, not just her job, but her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for. And Robert wasn't going to let her or anyone else escape the consequences. The truth had come to light, and now there was no going back. The system would change, one officer at a time, and Robert was going to make sure of it. In the end, this wasn't just about the slap. It was about confronting something much bigger, the deep-rooted racism within law enforcement. Robert had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced for far too long. This moment marked a turning point, an awakening that could no longer be ignored. While Robert knew real change would take time, he also knew it had to start somewhere. And this was as good a place as any. Holding Officer Green accountable was just the first step in addressing the systemic issues that had plagued their department. But it was more than just a lesson in justice. It was a powerful reminder that change doesn't come by staying silent, but by speaking up, even when the consequences are daunting. What do you think needs to be done to address systemic racism in law enforcement? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Share your thoughts below. Let's have a real conversation about the changes that need to happen. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's continue this conversation about justice and equality. We all have a part to play in making the world a better place, and these stories challenge the status quo, sparking the change we need. More stories are coming your way, so stay tuned and don't miss the next one.